Friends, I welcome you to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It is not difficult for you, but it is pleasant for me. And we're starting. Dave is one of the bravest and strongest characters I've ever met. He is a man of few words, and therefore it fell to me to tell his wonderful story. Let me tell you from the beginning. I forgive you in advance if you don't believe me, but I swear on my grandmother's grave, it's true. Okay, she's not dead yet, but you know what I mean? I compiled this story from interviews with his wife, friends, and other townspeople. By the way, my name is John. I'm a reporter for the Melbourne Times. You'll notice that I didn't mention Dave himself as a source of information. The reason for this is that I only made him talk to me once, and then he only said, "My father once told me, don't do anything, don't do anything, don't say anything, don't say anything." That's all I did. I have enough material, and it's weird enough material that I decided to write a book. It will be about the dynamics of a small town, as well as about the infidelity and actions of a wonderful person. A man of average intelligence who, faced with the choice given to him by the modern judicial system, decided to fight back in his own way. To be fair, this is my interpretation. Like I said, Dave doesn't talk much. My main source was his wife. She sounded like a canary mostly, I think, because of my promise of a couple thousand. She needed it to help with the legal bills. At the moment, a small staging of the scene is in order. At the beginning of this story, Dave and his wife lived in an isolated town of about 25,000 people, with their 3 children, Sarah, 15, Mike, 14, and Pete, 12. Dave is a mechanic. His wife works for the biggest fish in their small pond. This man is an old-fashioned bandit, the owner of the largest car dealership in the city. Everyone knows that the mayor of the city is resigning next year, and our man is the main contender for his place. He is in the lead because all the other declared candidates withdrew their interest, citing personal reasons. Like I said, he's an old bandit. The city has its own newspaper, which until very recently showed absolutely no interest in the story of Dave and his wife. What can I say? The owner of the newspaper drives a car with a sticker of some dealer on the back window. I work for a major newspaper based in the state capital. I was bullied at school, so even if it wasn't a very good story, I would still try to take part in Dave's fight with Goliath. Anyway, stop talking incessantly. Anne screamed into the pillow under her face as the man above her discharged himself into her. She was glad of this pillow. Faking facial expressions would also be a task that her acting skills simply couldn't handle. Trying to breathe under Donnie's relaxed weight, she thought it wasn't always like this. At first, the novelty of it all made it exciting in a different way, but without the long romantic setting. She knew that would change. Donnie was going somewhere, and she was going to be there when he arrived. There, for the romantic dinners and late-night love sessions she craved. She knew she didn't love Donnie, but that was fine because she didn't love Dave, her husband, either. It was enough for her to know that Donnie loved her, and she reasoned that she would eventually love him. Only 3 things interfered with her ideal plans. One of them was her own fault. Her strict Christian parents would never have approved of her behavior and what she was doing and intended to do with Dave. She hadn't expected this conversation with her husband. Although she did not love him, she respected him as a devoted, hardworking man who tried to do his best for his family. It's just a pity that his efforts weren't enough for Anne. Although the conversation was still a year away, she was already afraid of him. Secondly, Donnie refused to divorce his frigid wife until he was elected mayor. This condemned her to casual, hasty affairs in a motel, rather than late-night sessions after a romantic date. Every time he brought it up, she was forced to say that it would never happen. It humiliated his love for her in her mind. Returning to the present, as her fever began to fade, her guilt began to build. Donnie rolled off her and started getting dressed. As usual, she took a shower and left at least an hour after it. This way, no one will see them leave or return to work together. Donnie finished dressing and kissed her goodbye. Before he opened the door, she reminded him, "Look out the window and make sure that there is no one you know around." Donnie obediently parted the curtains and looked out, but suddenly recoiled and let the curtain fall. "Hey, Annie, there's a guy sitting on the hood of your car. He saw me pull back the curtain and looked at me." "What the hell?" Anne jumped out of bed and, opening the curtain, peeked out stealthily. "Damn it, this is Dave. Your husband?" "Yes, how the hell did he know I was here? I'm not ready for this conversation yet. Donnie, this could ruin our plans." "How? What is he going to do?" "No divorce lawyer in this city will take his case. I'll contact them this afternoon." But he can go to the press. Donnie laughed. In this city? I do not think so. They're too smart to post anything bad about me. They know that I will own this city for the next 10 years or until I run for public policy. Don't worry about them. Either way, it might be a good thing. You always say that we never have enough time together. Now he knows that everything can change. What is he going to do about it? I mean, look at this guy. He's half a foot shorter than me and about twice as heavy. He could have told your wife. You're right about that. I don't want this fool to notify us before we're ready. You know what? I'll go and talk to him. Donnie bent down to kiss Anne again and walked out the door. Anne opened the curtains again to see the confrontation. She looked straight into her husband's eyes. As she pulled down the curtain, she felt a gnawing sense of guilt. She waited a couple of minutes until Donnie raised his voice, and then opened the curtain again. What she saw upset her very much. Donnie bent over Dave, who was still sitting on her car. Their eyes met again through the curtain. Anne ran to the bathroom and took a shower until the water cooled down, and yet she couldn't wash away the guilt. Anne was already dressed and bracing herself to look out the window again when Donnie called. How quickly did hubby leave after I talked to him? I don't know. I haven't looked since you left. While Donnie was gathering his courage, Anne peeked out from behind the cracked curtain again. Damn, he's still there. Donnie was embarrassed. His position on tactics has always worked. Like most bullies, he had only one tactic. What did you tell him earlier? I just told him the facts of life and pointed out the danger to health of standing in our way and the futility of trying to do anything about it. What should I do now? I can't leave with him. It's going to be okay, Annie. It will be dark in an hour. Stay where you are and I'll send a couple, helpers to talk to him. True to their word, an hour later there was a loud knock on her door. Anne looked out and saw Frank and Rick, two of Donnie's employees, standing outside the door, holding Dave between them. They were so big that Dave's feet left the ground. She opened the door and they entered. Dave had a neutral expression on his face and he was just looking at Anne. She quickly averted her eyes and headed for the door. When she heard a sickening thud behind her and exhaled, it was pure reflex to look. She saw that Rick was holding Dave and Frank again with his fist raised. As she watched, Dave straightened up again and looked straight into her eyes. Feeling sick, Anne ran away. On the way home, she bought a takeaway to feed her family. She asked questions about where Dave was and why he wasn't answering their phone calls. She slept very poorly, and when she left for work the next day, her husband was still not there. Donnie wasn't there that day either, and she couldn't bring herself to talk to Frank or Rick. With extreme trepidation, she returned home immediately after the usual, into an empty house. She called Sarah and Mike, but both cell phones went straight to voicemail. Anne began to worry. It was well past lunchtime when she heard the sound of a car in the driveway. Looking out the window, she saw her children getting out of their parents' car with their mom and dad. They entered in a crowd. Her mother started the conversation. Annie, why didn't you tell us that Dave was in the hospital? Me? I did not know. There was silence in the room. Everyone stared at Anne. Finally, her father broke the silence. Maybe you didn't know, but the fact that you're not in a hurry to get there and you're not even interested in why he's there tells me that it's not surprising to you. Faced with this logic and 5 suddenly accusing glances, Anne could only fall into a chair and look away. She might as well have screamed guilty. After another minute of silence, she ran off to her room. She could hear her parents cooking dinner for her children. Her mother tried to force her out of the locked room, but Anne couldn't stand it. Eventually, when everything was quiet downstairs, she ventured out. The hum of children's conversation stopped abruptly when she entered the room. Have you all had dinner yet? The children stared at her in silence. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. Mom, you know how Dad got hurt, right? I had no idea he was in the hospital. There was silence again, and everyone, except maybe little Pete, admitted that the absence of denial was tantamount to recognition. This time he was interrupted by Pete's sobs. Anne hurried to him and hugged him. What's wrong, honey? It hurt me to see that Dad was in so much pain. He has broken ribs, a broken nose, and 2 black eyes. Anne recoiled in horror from what she could not prevent. Mike filled the silence. Why did you offend Dad, Mom? What did he do to you? Anne's response was purely reflex. He didn't do anything to me. Too slowly, she realized that once again she couldn't deny that she was the one who hurt Dave. Deep down, she blamed herself. She sent the children to bed and practically got drunk until she lost consciousness. The next day, Donnie refused to discuss Dave at work, but offered to discuss it later at their usual motel. Frustrated, Anne agreed. As soon as she came up, he tried to pet her, but she snapped at him until he stopped. He just shrugged when she asked what instructions he had given his thugs. When she described Dave's injuries, Donnie showed neither interest nor sympathy. She stormed out of the office and returned 2 minutes before him. The tension between them for the rest of the day was obvious to everyone within a 100-meter radius. She didn't worry that evening when the children weren't home before her. Again, her parents dropped them off, but as soon as they smelled the cooking dinner, they left without saying a word. All the children gave monosyllabic answers to any of her questions. Whenever she entered the room where they were, the conversation stopped. The next day at work, it was still cold and very uncomfortable. That evening in her empty house, she just sat at the kitchen table and thought about how to break the deadlock with the children. She was so deep in her thoughts that she barely noticed when her children returned, and when there was no dinner, Sarah and Mike were cooking around her. She only woke up when Sarah noisily put a plate in front of her. She was eating alone in the kitchen, and the children were sitting in front of the TV. She just couldn't stand those accusing looks. She shuddered at the thought of what Dave was doing to their heads. After another cold day at work, she returned home to a noisy house. Her mother met her at the door. "Are you going to feed your children today?" "Of course, Mom." "All right," her mother interrupted and left the house. Anne turned around and saw Pete carrying a plate of cheese and cookies up the stairs. "Hey, there's no food upstairs, you know." "Dad's hungry," Pete called over his shoulder as he continued up the stairs. That's how Anne found out that Dave was home. She busied herself with cooking dinner, glancing at the stairs from time to time. It was only 13 steps, but it was a psychological chasm. At any given moment, 1 or 2 children were upstairs. Sarah took the food from Dave. As they sat at the dinner table, Pete innocently asked, "If Dad didn't do anything to you, why did you offend him? Why don't you want to talk to him?" Anne didn't have an answer for that. When Sarah started explaining the concept of guilt to Peter, she ran away, leaving an unfinished dinner. Anne had been gone for hours. When she returned, all the children were already asleep. She needed things from the master bedroom and bathroom, so she sneaked upstairs and peeked through the open door. Dave seemed to be sleeping on his side, facing the door. The sight of his swollen face with white stripes holding his nose in place bypassed everything and went straight to her conscience. The sound of his ragged breathing almost killed her. Anne gathered everything she needed as quietly as possible and went to the spare room opposite. She returned to the bedroom with the intention of whispering to apologize to the man she once loved, a man whose current mental and physical pain she could have prevented. Kneeling down next to the bed, she saw that his eyes were open and looking at her. She ran away again. That night, Anne couldn't sleep again. Across 2 walls in a hallway, she could feel Dave's eyes boring into her. When her relationship with Donnie first became serious, she knew that conflict with Dave was inevitable. She replayed over and over in her head what she would say to Dave. Now that it had turned from an academic exercise into a reality, it hit harder than she had ever imagined. Anne got Donnie to talk to her the next morning and tried to get him to divorce his wife. He was adamant that there would be no divorce or confession of infidelity before the election. If she wants to divorce her husband now, that's her business. He would have helped her with her vacation and money, but in fact, she was on her own. It was then that Anne first suspected that she might just be a buddy for Donnie, although she was far from convinced. The heat from the burning bridge behind her forced her to follow her chosen path. She took the day off to meet with a lawyer and arranged for Dave to be served as soon as the paperwork was ready. She left the service entirely in the hands of a lawyer. To speed up the divorce, she kept her demands reasonable. She has primary custody, but with liberal visitation rights for him and formulated alimony for her and child support. She also wanted to live in the house until she was ready to move in. This should happen immediately after the elections next year. The next part of the story won't make sense if you don't know the location of the dealership that Donnie owns and Anne works for. There is a huge exhibition hall in front of the building. Along the back wall, there are 4 glass-walled classrooms, one behind the other, with solid walls between them. In the far right corner is Donnie, then Anne, then 2 belonging to the administrator and the service manager. Since the offices are long and narrow, there is only one place where you can put a desk, at the opposite end from the door, at the end wall. Since Donnie and Anne's doors are at opposite ends of their offices, this means that their desks are mostly together, with a solid wall between them. The service center is located behind the house. Anne didn't see Dave enter the car dealership. She was busy tapping on the keyboard. After entering, he went straight to the reception desk. He leaned on her and just stared straight out of Anne's window. One of the two secretaries recognized him. He coached her softball team in high school. She knew it was Anne's husband, even though he had never been there before. She tried to engage him in conversation, but he just stared indifferently at the offices. The secretary couldn't figure out who was the target, Anne or Donnie. While she was still talking, another girl sitting at the front desk came into Anne's office and told her that Dave was there. Anne turned her head sharply. From her point of view, there was no doubt where Dave's eyes were looking. They drilled it even from a distance of 12 meters. Anne quickly broke eye contact, and yet she could feel his gaze on her. Without looking, she reached for the shutter control button and turned it to the "he can't see me now" position. After a minute, she stuck her finger between two slats and looked out. The two girls in the waiting room were whispering conspiratorially. Dave was still staring at her window, and his now familiar neutral expression was clearly visible through the bruises and bandages. With his burning gaze through the blinds, Anne picked up the phone and called Donnie. She told him to look out the window. "Damn it, what is he doing here?" "I do not know, Donnie." Donnie hung up the phone and went to the reception desk. "Mr. Brown, this is a private matter. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Dave didn't recognize Donnie in any way. He just kept looking. "Come on, don't make me call the police." Without taking his eyes off Anne's window, Dave reached into his pocket and handed the phone to Donnie. Donnie lowered his voice to a level he thought only Dave could hear. "Listen, asshole. I'm using your wife. Get over it." The trouble was, Donnie had no idea about the power of his own voice. Both girls at the table clearly heard his quiet comment. In her office, peering through the gap between the Venetians again, Anne saw both heads turn towards her. Then she saw Donnie returning to his office. 2 minutes later, she heard a commotion in the reception area. She made another crack and looked out. What she saw horrified her. Frank and Rick grabbed Dave by the arms and dragged him to the exit. Dave rode backwards and stared at her all the way until she was out of sight. Anne thought to herself, "It serves him right. Why can't he just let me go?" Then she remembered that all her conversations with Dave were still in her head. Until he caught her at the motel with Donnie, he didn't even know their marriage was in danger. With so much shock, it was no wonder he was at a loss. She was not completely devoid of empathy and genuinely sympathized with Dave. Anne rushed to the door and left the office. She saw Donnie with a sadistic grin on his face. "No, Donnie, no, not again. Let me do this, woman." With that, Donnie nodded to Anne to return to her office. She opened the blinds again and began to boil. Donnie canceled his afternoon appointments and stayed in his office. Anne noticed that employees were constantly flocking to the reception area, and numerous small groups were forming and dispersing. She was distracted from thinking about what it all meant. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 policemen arrived and talked to the administrators. Donnie must have seen them. They were invited into his office. The blinds were closed, and after 15 minutes they left. Anne was afraid to return home, so before leaving, she asked if she could move into a motel that the company rented on a permanent basis. She made her way home before the children returned from school and packed her suitcase. She then sent a text message to Dave and Sarah's phone saying she wouldn't be home. At the end of the day, Donnie helped her unpack. Desperate for a distraction, she let him use her. At 6:30 p.m., her mother called. Before she answered, she thought how typical it was for Dave to use his own family against her. "Where the hell are you, Anne? Why aren't you at home to feed your children?" I'm not coming home today. Dave can keep an eye on them. Dave is back in the hospital. This time he will stay there for at least a week." "What? I'll be back home as soon as I can." Anne pushed Donnie away. "What did you do to him this time?" "That stubborn jerk has to understand that I'm not being trifled with, Anne." Anne dressed quickly and ran home, picking up the takeaway. The first thing she noticed when she opened the front door was all 3 children crying in the living room, comforted by her parents. Her mother intercepted her and led her to the kitchen. "What the hell is going on, Anne? You're abandoning the kids while your husband is in intensive care." Anne watched her mother's nostrils flare. "Only then do you come home with food for your children. What's going on, Anne?" "It's none of your business, Mom. Dave and I are going through some tough times right now, that's all." The 2 women stared at each other in silence for half a minute. Her mother was the first to break the silence. I noticed that you weren't surprised when you found out that your husband was in the hospital. This tells me that the children are telling the truth. You really had something to do with Dave being in intensive care. No, Mom, I had no idea that Dave was back in the hospital. There was silence in the conversation again. Once again, it was Anne's mother who broke it. Well, what? Aren't you curious what your boyfriend did to your husband this time? What guy? Come on, Anne, you reek of making love. Anne stared at the floor and was silent. Well, since you're so interested, I'll tell you. This time, the doctors are sure that his cheekbone is broken and possibly his skull. They are sure that one of the ribs broken last time was pressed into his chest and pierced his lung. The ambulance driver told me that they picked him up in an alley near your work. Tell me, Anne, what has this poor man done to you to deserve such treatment? Anne couldn't answer. She was too busy sobbing. Her mother sat in silence until Anne ran upstairs to her bedroom. She noticed blood on the sheets of the bed she hadn't slept in for 4 days. She screamed in pain into the pillow. She had no idea how long she had been there, but finally there was a soft knock on the door. It was her mother. I have to take Dad home. All this stress is causing him blood pressure problems. He almost fainted when he got up just now. Okay, Mom, I'll walk you out. When Anne came downstairs, her father was already coming out of the front door. He turned to give her a withering look, but said nothing. While she was saying goodbye, the children went to bed. Anne sat and tried to figure out how to get out of this train wreck. She could only see ahead. Breakfast the next day was held in silence. When Anne arrived at work, she found that Donnie had left for the whole day. She desperately needed to be sure that at least the future side of her plan was on track. So she texted Donnie and asked him to meet her at the motel that evening. Then she texted her mother and asked her to meet the children after school and watch their dinner, as she had things to do. The answer was, yes, it's a good idea. Donnie met her after work and assured her that their plan was correct. The police could not connect either of them to the two facts of Dave's beatings. Anne did not bring up the subject of her husband's second attack. Of course, Donnie had arranged everything, but she could have stopped it by just running after them when her husband was carried out the door. She let Donnie make love to her until 9 at night, then Anne took a shower and went home. Although it was almost 10 when she arrived, all 3 children woke up and looked at her expectantly. Why aren't you guys in bed? Her mother answered for them. I've given them permission to stay up until you get home. They really want to know how their father is doing. I don't know. What? Didn't you go to see him tonight? Anne's silence answered for her. And what did you do? Tell me you didn't ask me to cover for you here while you went to see your lover while Dave was in the hospital. I never told you I was going to the hospital. Her mother turned around, grabbed her coat, and headed for the door. With one hand on the handle, she threw over her shoulder. You disgust me. I'm ashamed to call you my daughter. Don't ask me to look after your children anymore, except to go to my husband and ask him for forgiveness. Anne thought she had learned to cope with 3 hours of intermittent sleep a night. As I said, I never knew Dave, but judging by the way other people describe him, he might have forgiven Anne up to this point if she had just given up on her plans. But she didn't. From what she told me later, she thought she had caused so much pain at that moment that retreating would make it all pointless. When Anne's mother called her at work the next day, she thought she might want to apologize, but it wasn't like that. Anne, how could you be so heartless? What are you talking about, Mom? Your husband is finally coming out of intensive care, and what is he getting? A visit from his loving wife? No, an ugly package and divorce papers. Who are you, Anne? What did you do to my daughter? In her pain, Anne completely forgot that her divorce process was on autopilot. The lawyer apparently followed her instructions and handed it to Dave as soon as the papers were ready. Reflexively, she tried to remove the splinter in her side. Mom, could you look after the kids tonight so I can see Dave? No, damn it, I can't, Anne. Your father is in the same hospital as your husband. He had a heart attack today. They're going to put stents in tomorrow. Goodbye, Anne. Anne hurried home early to catch the children getting off the school bus. The bus arrived without 3 familiar faces, and again, calls to their 2 phones went straight to voicemail. 2 hours later, she received a message to pick them up from the hospital. They all went there after school. On the way home, she scolded them for making her worry. They were all silent and looked out the car window. Soon after, I found out about the tragic story of Anne, Dave, and Donnie. I was sitting in my office and wondering where my next story would come from. The world was going through an unusually quiet, peaceful period, and news was hard to find. The phone rang. It was an old buddy I went to journalism school with, Matt Nigram. He was good at what he did, but tended to avoid large organizations in order to focus on the problems of small towns where he could make a difference. He was in the regional center where our story took place for about a year. The doctors and nurses at the hospital where Dave served were so shocked by his wife's behavior that they contacted Matt. With his usual talent, Matt quickly talked to several people from the dealership and found out about Ann and Donnie's affair, in addition to the 2 beatings that Dave had endured. No one came out and said so directly, but the fact that Dave was seen by 3 witnesses being carried out of the car dealership by 2 well-known associates of Donnie led to his own conclusion. Matt tried to talk to Dave, but he refused. He then contacted the police to find out where their investigation was, but was told that there was no active investigation into the matter. He presented the article to his editor and had the pleasure of seeing it tear up in front of his eyes. Not a single negative story about Donnie will be published in this city. He immediately resigned and sent the story to me. I met with my editor, and the following week Matt received an offer from my newspaper. 2 days later, I cleared the table and went on a mission to Hicksville. From what Ann told me, the next week was very unpleasant for her. Her children treated her like a leper, and her social life was limited by the absence of a mother who could look after the children. She picked them up from the hospital every night. Donnie was away on business every day during work hours, and she only saw him one night when he managed to sneak into her house after the children had gone to bed. It was the first time they had spent the whole night together. She definitely craved company. On Friday, Ann received a call from the school and was invited to an urgent discussion. It was then that she found out that they were very concerned about Sarah's rapid weight loss. Ann couldn't believe she'd been so careless without noticing it. They moved on to talk about Michael's sudden propensity for violence and how little Pete was bullied because he was constantly crying. At these words, Ann burst into tears. All she could think about was speeding up the divorce as quickly as possible and hoping it would go away. At first, Ann declined an invitation to go out with 4 girlfriends on a Friday night. Dave was still in the hospital and Donnie was unavailable. She tried everything she could to get the children to talk, but she couldn't. In desperation, she left the children at home and went for a walk with the girls. She left the name of the place where she would be to Sarah in case anything happened. She stayed there for about an hour, answering questions from friends who had heard the rumors, denying that she was aware of the violence committed against her husband. They finally relented and moved on to more interesting topics when she saw 2 of them looking over her shoulder. She turned around and saw Dave. One eye was slightly black, the other was jet black. A bandage covered one side of his face below his eye, and he hunched over, protecting his painful ribs. He was sitting at the next table and just looking at her. In a panic, Ann turned around, went back to her friends and ruined everything. "Oh, don't mind him." Her friends saw her instant reaction and heard her flippant comment. They also saw Dave suffering and could only wonder at the commitment he had to make to go there and express his silent protest, for it was obvious. In the last hour, they had seen for themselves Ann's honesty. One of them came up with an excuse to go to the bar. The 2 who knew Dave best came over to chat with him. The 4th looked at Ann questioningly. Ann ran away again. She stopped at the bar, wondering if she should offer Dave a ride. However, her own conscience did not allow her to talk to him yet. Although it was decent, she just couldn't do it. 2 weeks ago, she had told him that she loved him in order to avert any suspicion. Now he knew it was a lie. Ann went home. Her mother was there, looking after the children. They hadn't seen each other for a week, and Ann suddenly realized that she hadn't even asked about her father's health. God, how selfish has she become? They both put the children to bed. Then Ann asked about her father, but tried to change the subject when her mother raised a sensitive question about Dave. But her mother didn't experience anything like that. She asked Ann if Dave had done anything to justify her divorce. Ann mentioned a couple of minor quibbles, but when she saw that she was not convinced by her mother, she continued to explain that she simply fell out of love with her husband and fell in love with someone else. It was easy for her to lie to her mother. She certainly wasn't going to mention that she was using Donnie's attention to her as an opportunity to have fun, so to speak. An older woman allowed her daughter to express her opinion. Ann sat there feeling awkward. She strongly denied having anything to do with Dave's 2 beatings. After all, she didn't ask if her mother had discussed with her husband whether he would forgive her for attacking their marriage. In her mind, the plan remained intact. She asked if Dave would return home that evening and was coldly told that he should be discharged in 2 days. She realized that Dave must have sneaked out of the hospital to go to the bar earlier. Anne thought a lot over the next 2 days. She decided it would be more appropriate to apologize to Dave for her infidelity, but point out that the beatings were the result of his own immature behavior. She will demand that he talk to the children and explain that she has nothing to do with his pain. She thought there was a reasonable chance that he would agree to it, and a small chance that he would ask her to stay. One thing was for sure. Any aggression on his part would lead to the threat of reducing the share of marital property in the split. Dave had other plans. The night he was discharged from the hospital, Anne and Donnie left work early and went to a motel. Not needing any secrecy, they both left the room just after 6 in the evening. Dave, Sarah, Mike, and Peter watched them silently from the opposite side of the parking lot. Donnie immediately headed towards them. All 3 children stood in front of Dave. Dave said something Anne couldn't hear, and then stood in front of them, protecting them. Donnie looked at the 3 witnesses, turned and walked away. Anne sneaked back to her car and drove away. Dave took the children to eat and returned home with them shortly before 8. Anne heard them come in, laughing and talking. She continued to wash the dishes. When she was done, she went into the living room, intending to separate Dave from the children and present her ultimatum. The 3 children fell silent when she entered. Dave was nowhere to be seen. When she asked where he was, she was told that he had taken painkillers and gone to bed. She tried in vain to get the children to talk to her normally. It failed. She sent them to bed. Exhausted, she decided to go to bed early. At the top of the stairs, she saw that the light was on in the guest room, and there was a pile of her clothes and toiletries on the bed. Swearing that this shit had to stop right now, she headed for the master bedroom door. It was locked. Downstairs, she took out a spare key from the kitchen. Thinking that Dave was behaving very differently from the man she knew, she armed herself with a rolling pin for self-defense just in case. Using the key, she opened the bedroom door. The light from the hallway illuminated Dave on the bed and the figure in the sleeping bag on the mattress on this side. While she was taking in this sight, the figure in the bag rose to reveal Mike standing between her and Dave. Mike looked at the rolling pin and hissed furiously, "You won't hurt my father anymore." Anne wanted to say that it was all a mistake, that she would never hurt Dave. She saw the futility of it in Mike's eyes. Instead, she retreated to her room, sobbing. Did she sleep like a baby that night? What do you think? When it was time to leave the next morning, Dave was still asleep. The children took turns walking. 2 were having breakfast in the kitchen, and the 3rd was sitting halfway up the stairs. It was so obvious that it was a guard that Anne's heart was breaking. She left and spent the day planning a speech on how to win back her children's trust. She returned home at the usual time. Dave and the kids were talking in the living room. She barked at the children to go to the kitchen. They looked at Dave, who nodded. When he struggled to get up, she ordered him to stay away. As soon as the 3 children sat down at the kitchen table, Anne stopped, looking down at them, facing the door, the table between her and the table. She opened her mouth to begin the prepared speech, when suddenly she saw her tormentor standing right outside the door. Almost 2 weeks of guilt, self-loathing, disappointment, and lack of sleep made something inside Anne turn over. Dave's neutral expression was the last straw. Purely by reflex, Anne destroyed the remnants of her life. With a strength she didn't even know she had, she grabbed a heavy glass fruit bowl that stood in the center of the table and hurled it at her tormentor. At the last moment, it slipped out of her hands. This caused her aim to be shot down. As if in slow motion, she saw the bowl heading towards the doorframe. Just before she hit, she looked at Dave's face. Now she could swear that the neutral expression on her face had been replaced by a smile. However, it was the only movement of his muscles when the heavy bowl hit the frame. It split into 2 parts. One piece hit the frame harmlessly. This was not the case with the other part. It deviated by about 30 degrees and hit the undamaged side of Dave's face. Still in slow motion, Anne watched in horror as bright scarlet blood sprayed from the deep cut before her husband slowly knelt down and then fell to his side. Like in a movie projector, life sped up again. The children, initially stunned by the silence, began to scream at the same time. Mike reacted first, jumped up and stood over his father, protecting him. Seeing the blood still pulsing on Dave's face, Anne instinctively grabbed a hand towel and rolled it up, walking towards her lying husband. She intended to use it to stop the bleeding. Mike raised his hands to push her away, but she firmly pushed him away. He fell heavily. Anne knelt down and pressed a towel to Dave's face. Not at all girlish, Sarah pushed her mother away from her father. Seeing that his angry sister was confronting his mother, Mike got up, ran to the medicine cabinet, grabbed a sterile swab, tore it open, and carefully applied it to his father's face. "Call 911 urgently," Sarah shouted to Peter. Realizing how bad everything was, Anne rushed to the phone. By controlling the call, she hoped to simply call an ambulance without letting the police in. She had just put her hand on the phone when she heard Mike scream, "Call from the phone upstairs, Sarah." At some point, Anne realized that they had misinterpreted her actions as a desire to stop using the phone. Sarah ran past her to the stairs. Anne gave chase, but little Pete stopped her in the only way he could. He wrapped his arms around her shins. Anne wanted to take a step, but she fell heavily because her legs wouldn't obey her. She lay there screaming hysterically, then resolutely took Pete's hands away, got up and ran. That was the first time I saw Anne in the flesh. One hand is covered in blood. She runs to her car. "I just came to ask for an interview. After seeing a bloody, screaming woman, I took the liberty of inviting myself and took over Dave's treatment." An ambulance arrived, followed by the police. While Dave was being taken away, the police started asking questions. I arranged with Sarah to call Grandma and look after them. That's how I found out firsthand what happened to Dave this time, when the children told how their mother attacked their father, and then allegedly tried to strangle him and prevent them from calling an ambulance. I've already interviewed enough people to suspect that the local police aren't overly protective of Dave's interests. So I called the state police, and 3 hours later, 2 members of the flying squad showed up. A flying squad is a group of police officers who move from city to city. Taking into account that local forces can sometimes be a little interested, a flying squad comes to the city, detains local bad drivers for a few days, and then moves. I've already interviewed enough people to suspect that the local police aren't overly protective of Dave's interests. So I called the state poli, and 3 hours later, 2 members of the flying squad showed up. A flying ad is a group of police officers who move from city to city. Taking into account that local forces can sometimes be a little interested, a flying squad comes to the city, detains local bad drivers for a few days, and then moves on. I stayed long enough to see the children testify again, and then I took Sarah and Mike to their father. That's when I got my only words from him. I took them home and took my leave. Unbeknownst to me, Anne ran away to Donnie's house. His wife met her at the door. Donnie, thinking quickly, explained to his wife that Anne was his employee with an abusive husband. A generous woman offered her house as a shelter for the night. Anne was too upset to go to work the next day, but Donnie went, leaving the women alone. Immediately after lunch, Donnie's wife Pamela was in the kitchen, but upset to go to work the next day. But Donnie went, leaving the women alone. Immediately after lunch, Donnie's wife Pamela was in the car. The police arrived and recognized Dave. One of them came to the door and asked Pam if Anne was home. Pam innocently agreed. To her surprise, Anne was arrested. In order not to answer his wife's difficult questions, Donnie went to look for a lawyer for Anne. He had to keep it all under control. Very soon he returned home when Pam called and said that the creepy man was still looking at their house. On the way home, he hatched a plan, the one that involved waiting for darkness. He entertained Pam all day. I was at the police station, having learned about the morning drama on the police radio, and I was trying to find out what Anne would be accused of. They weren't very talkative. Then I spent a couple of hours trying to find Dave, but I had no luck there either. Eventually, I went back to the motel and started typing the article while listening to the police radio. That's how I found Dave. As soon as it got dark, Donnie must have called the police to take Dave. I heard they were sent to Donnie's residence. I jumped into my car and got there just as the police were watching Dave get into his car and drive away. This guy seemed to attract trouble, so I decided to follow him. I was within sight of his house when he turned into the driveway and barely got out of the car. I saw 2 shadows separate from the trees and approach him. One of them raised his hand and hit Dave on the back of the head with something. I didn't wait any longer, started the engine and illuminated the scene with my headlights. I took a couple of pictures with my ubiquitous camera. The 2 big men ran up the street, leaving Dave motionless behind. I called the ambulance and the police again and waited for poor Dave to be taken to the hospital for the 4th time in 2 weeks. I suspected that Dave would not be able to survive another episode like this. What I witnessed was not a prelude to a beating, but something much more serious. I gave a statement to the police of the flying squad and handed over my photos. Dave spent another night in the hospital while he was checked for another concussion. I was in court the next day when the judge charged Anne with assault occasioning grievous bodily harm. The police made it clear that the attempted murder could be added later. Donnie bailed her out, gave her a wad of money, and took her to a motel. He suggested that she threw away her phone, as there was a high probability that this was how Dave was tracking her. He also asked that, apart from work, she stay away from him. With someone else's reporter sniffing around, well, he just doesn't need bad publicity. Anne was shocked. Donnie was all she had left of her old life, and the reason it all went down the drain. She asked how he could treat her so badly if he loved her. Donnie couldn't help the contempt that appeared on his face. At that moment, Anne realized that he did not love her at all, but was just entertaining him a little on the side. A little fun, which has now become a big hindrance. To confirm this, Donnie rather coldly told her what her life would be like if she tried to make a wave for him. Then he left. He had an urgent job. His employees did not answer the phone. Anne was tormented by the train wreck that her life had become, and by the fact that she had lost absolutely everything. She didn't even have a first aid kit with pills or a bathtub to slit her wrists. She cheered up a little when Donnie was arrested 2 days later. My photos of the night of Dave's last attack led to his thugs being apprehended very quickly. To save their asses, they immediately pounced on Donnie. Now his power and influence were working against him, and he was refused bail. When my article was published in the weekly that weekend, his wife dumped him faster than a rat on the Titanic. However, the dealership survived, and Anne continued her lonely existence until the trial. She made a difficult deal with her mother to get things from her old house, but she never saw Dave or the children again. Anne was honest when the police questioned her about Dave's first 2 beatings, thinking they had nothing to do with her. This led to the fact that she was charged with 2 charges: failure to report a crime and complicity in the attack. Dave was granted temporary custody of their 3 children. In the end, he decided to contact the children's services. One particularly belligerent local officer sided with Anne and began the process to transfer custody to her. It was against the wishes of all 3 children. Dave, realizing that custody of the children was in his own best interests, continued to insist on increasing the chances of getting the right result. When the child care worker insisted, Dave began to sit outside her house staring at him. Although the police moved him to another place, it brought the desired result. Soon, neighbors reported loud arguments coming from the house. Her husband could be heard screaming, "Let me figure it out. This fool ambushes a guy, hangs around him, sits and does nothing when they put him in the hospital twice, and then tries to kill him in front of the children, and you still take her side?" An hour after this exchange, a government employee was dragging suitcases to his car. The case was dismissed. Anne still hadn't plucked up the courage to end it all when the district court came to town. With such irrefutable evidence, all 4 parties pleaded guilty. Frank and Rick got 3 years, Anne got 4, and Donnie got 8. No one saw Anne being lowered from the dock by a special ladder into the cells. It was only at that moment that the full reality dawned on her. She wrote a long letter to her children apologizing for what she had done to their family. She wrote another letter to Dave. There was no apology in it, everything was too bad for that, but she begged him to look after the children. Dave became somewhat of a local celebrity and did not lack attention from the local available ladies. He even went on dates when family matters allowed, or when Sarah and Mike left him no choice. When a special lady caught his attention, Sarah and Mike met with her alone one evening and gave her a thorough interrogation, at the end of which they announced that she was worthy to continue dating their manly daddy. Things are still going well with them, and Sarah is thinking about giving Dave a hint about the offer. The epilogue. Anne screamed into her pillow. This time the scream was very sincere. Her mind was desperately trying to erase the terrible reality of her situation. It was a little difficult to do when she was on her knees, backwards up. To distract herself, she focused on all the feelings except the feeling of being overwhelmed. At first, there were smells around her. Disinfectant, margarine, which her partner used as a lubricant, and yes, shit. She knew the taste. She knew from experience that the taste would leave her mouth only in the morning. Anne continued to sob until, with relief, she heard the unmistakable sounds of the man behind her reaching a climax. Thank the hell for that. There were only a few minutes left before relief from humiliation and pain. Her bed partner tensed and shuddered in muted ecstasy before finally collapsing sideways next to Anne. Gradually, Anne felt the groping stop, followed by a soft snore behind her. She leaned forward cautiously. She knew from experience that she had to calculate the exact time of retreat. He promised to talk to the authorities to convey one simple request to Anne, to transfer her to another cell. Anne slowly moved away from the hard plastic phallus. She was already halfway to the exit when life returned to the arms around her, and she felt the big, heavy breasts pressing against her back again. Anne began to sob again. As for Donnie, what can I say? He was in a 4-person cell and quickly realized that being a thug in a small town doesn't mean much in a state prison. He was also starting to feel like an unsuccessful heavyweight boxer. So how did I go? Have I developed Dave's character enough? No, I didn't develop it at all. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I don't care about the circumstances under which couples meet and get married. It doesn't matter if they are fat, thin, short, tall, white, black, or purple with green spots. There are standards of decency and behavior that cannot be violated. Now relax. 2 friends are fishing near the bridge. Suddenly a hearse and 2 funeral cars pass over the bridge. One of the men stands up, takes off his cap, and bows his head. When the cars have left, he puts on his cap again, sits down, and continues fishing. His mate turns to him and says, "Dave, this is one of the nicest and most respectful things I've ever seen." Dave answers, "Well, we've been married for almost 20 years.